Today I'm going to tell you a secret about something that happened to me that I'm not proud of. It was very satisfying and exciting, although it ended badly. Please listen to my story until the end and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. I never thought my life would take such an unexpected turn at 50 years old. My name is Helen, and I'm a science professor at the same university, where I graduated almost 3 decades ago. I've always been a woman dedicated to my career, perhaps too much. That's what led to the failure of my marriage with Charles, a wonderful man who simply couldn't bear competing with my passion for teaching and research. After our divorce, I found myself single and childless, facing a new stage of life that I never imagined I'd live. Despite my age, I pride myself on maintaining a good appearance. Regular exercise and a healthy diet have been my allies, and I can't deny that I still enjoy the appreciative glances I receive when walking across campus. I've dated several men since my divorce, but none have managed to capture my interest for long. Something is always missing. That spark, that connection I desperately yearn for. Maybe I'm too demanding, or perhaps, deep down, I still haven't completely gotten over Charles. Whatever the reason, I've resigned myself to the idea that true love may not be in the cards for me. Everything changed the day the dean called me to his office. I vividly remember sitting in front of his imposing mahogany desk as he explained that the university was implementing a new program to improve student retention in the early years. As part of this initiative, I was assigned to teach younger students, mainly freshmen and sophomores. I confess that at first, the idea didn't excite me. I was used to working with senior and graduate students, those who had already demonstrated their passion and commitment to science. The prospect of dealing with young people fresh out of high school, with their raging hormones and lack of focus, seemed like an unnecessary challenge at this point in my career. However, as I've always done, I accepted the challenge with determination. I set out to give my best and prove that I could connect with these young students as well as I did with the older ones. What I didn't know at that moment was that this decision would change my life in ways I could never have imagined. The first day of classes arrived faster than I expected. I stood in front of the classroom full of young, enthusiastic faces, some nervous, others defiant. Among the crowd, a pair of intense, brown eyes caught my attention. They belonged to a tall, athletic young man with dark, messy hair that seemed deliberately unkempt. His relaxed posture and penetrating gaze intrigued me from the first moment. That young man was Luke, and I would soon discover that he would be the biggest challenge of my teaching career. From the beginning, Luke was problematic. He arrived late to class, interrupted my explanations with sarcastic comments, and constantly challenged my authority. His rebellious attitude contrasted with his evident intelligence, which frustrated me even more. I could see the potential in him, but he seemed determined to waste it. I tried to approach Luke in various ways. I tried talking to him after class, offered additional tutoring, even communicated with his other professors to better understand his situation. But all my efforts seemed useless. Luke remained an enigma, a disruptive force in my class that kept me awake at night, thinking about how I could reach him. The breaking point came one day when Luke crossed all boundaries. In the middle of an important practical demonstration, he abruptly stood up, knocked over the equipment, and stormed out of the classroom, slamming the door. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel all the students' eyes on me, waiting for my reaction. With all the calm I could muster, I asked them to continue with their experiments, and went after Luke. I found him in the hallway, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and a defiant expression on his face. "Luke," I said firmly, "I need you to come to my office right now. To my surprise, he didn't protest. He followed me silently to my office, where I closed the door behind us. I sat behind my desk and stared at him, waiting for an explanation. "Well," I asked after a long silence, "do you have anything to say about your behavior?" Luke kept his gaze fixed on the floor for a moment before looking up. What I saw in his eyes left me breathless. It wasn't the rebellion or defiance I expected, but a mixture of vulnerability and something else, something I couldn't identify at that moment. "I'm sorry, Professor," he muttered. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." "Luke," I sighed, feeling that we were finally getting somewhere. "I've tried to understand you, to help you, but I can't do that if you don't let me. What's really going on?" It was then that Luke looked me directly in the eyes and said the words that would change everything. "I'm in love with you, Professor." The silence that followed his confession was deafening. I felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. My mind went blank for a moment, unable to process what I had just heard. "Luke," I finally managed to say, my voice barely a whisper, "you don't know what you're saying. This isn't right." But even as I spoke those words, I felt something stir inside me, a spark of emotion I hadn't experienced in years. I realized, with a mixture of horror and excitement, that the attraction was mutual. Luke moved closer to me, his gaze intense and determined. "I know exactly what I'm saying, Helen," he said, using my first name for the first time. "I've tried to fight this, but I can't. Every time I see you, every time I hear your voice explaining complex concepts with such passion, I go crazy." I should have stopped him right there. I should have reminded him of our age difference, the forbidden relationship between teacher and student, all the reasons why this was wrong. But at that moment, with Luke so close, with the scent of his cologne invading my senses, all my defenses crumbled. Before I could think about the consequences, our lips met in a passionate kiss. It was as if an electric current ran through my entire body. Luke's hands tangled in my hair, while mine clung to his shirt, pulling him closer. What followed was a whirlwind of passion and unbridled desire. In a matter of minutes, clothes started to disappear, and we found ourselves making love on my desk, not caring about the risk of being discovered. It was intense, passionate, and completely irresponsible. When it was all over and reality began to settle in, panic took over me. What had I done? I had crossed a line that I should never have crossed. I had betrayed my professional ethics, the trust the university had placed in me. "This can't happen again," I said, more to myself than to Luke, as I hurriedly dressed. Luke looked at me with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "Helen, please don't regret this. What I feel for you is real." I wanted to believe him. Part of me desperately wanted to abandon myself to this madness, to this passion that had awakened feelings I thought long dead. But the rational part of my brain screamed in protest. "Luke, you're my student. I'm your professor. This is wrong on so many levels," I said, trying to sound firm despite the tremor in my voice. "Does it feel wrong?" he asked, approaching me again. "Because to me, it feels like the most right thing I've ever done in my life." And with those words, with that intense look and that smile that melted my defenses, I knew I was lost. Despite all the alarms going off in my head, despite knowing I was playing with fire, I couldn't resist. Thus began our clandestine relationship. We saw each other in secret, taking advantage of every moment alone we could find. My office became our refuge, the place where we could be ourselves without the judgment of the outside world. With Luke, I felt alive again. The passion and intensity he brought to my life were addictive. He made me feel desired, appreciated, in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Each encounter was an intoxicating mix of physical desire and emotional connection. But with each moment of ecstasy came also a growing sense of guilt and fear. I knew what we were doing was wrong, that I was risking everything I had worked so hard for. My career, my reputation, everything was at stake, and yet I couldn't stop myself. The weeks flew by in a whirlwind of passion and secrets. I learned to live a double life, the respected Professor Helen during the day and the passionate lover by night. It was exhausting and exciting at the same time. My story isn't over yet. Please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you. Back to the story. It was during a university event when everything began to crumble. I was standing next to a group of colleagues, pretending to be interested in their conversation, while my eyes searched for Luke in the crowd. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to find myself face to face with a man who seemed strangely familiar. "Professor Helen," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Robert, Luke's father. Could we talk in private for a moment?" Panic instantly overwhelmed me, but I managed to maintain a facade of calm as I nodded and followed him to a quiet corner of the room. Once there, Robert got straight to the point. "I know what's going on between you and my son," he said in a low voice, but with a tone that chilled the blood. I felt as if the ground was opening up beneath my feet. "I don't know what you're talking about." I tried to deny, but my trembling voice betrayed me. Robert smiled, but there was no warmth in his expression. "Please, Professor, don't insult us both. I have evidence, photos, messages, enough to ruin your career and my son's life." Terror paralyzed me. Everything I had worked for, my whole life, was about to crumble. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. "I want you to help me with a little problem," Robert replied, his gaze running over me in a way that made me feel dirty. "Let's say I'd like to experience the same thing my son has been enjoying." The implication was clear and repugnant. Robert was blackmailing me to obtain sexual favors. The idea turned my stomach, but what choice did I have? If I refused, everything would come to light. I would lose my job, my reputation, everything. With a heavy heart and feeling that every word burned my throat, I slowly nodded. "All right," I said, hating myself for my weakness. Robert smiled, satisfied. "Excellent. I'll contact you soon with the details." And so, in a matter of minutes, my life became even more complicated. Now, I was not only maintaining a forbidden relationship with my student, but I was also being blackmailed by his father. The following days were hell. Every time my phone rang, my heart raced, fearing it was Robert with his details. Luke noticed my change in behavior and asked me several times what was wrong, but how could I tell him the truth? How could I explain that his father was blackmailing me? Finally, the message I so feared arrived. Robert wanted to see me at a hotel on the outskirts of the city. With a heavy heart and feeling that each step was taking me closer to the abyss, I went to the appointment. What happened in that hotel room is something I've tried to erase from my memory. Robert was not gentle or considerate. He was rough, dominant, taking what he wanted without caring about my discomfort or my pain. I felt used, dirty, completely stripped of my dignity. When it was all over, I dressed in silence, tears running down my cheeks. Robert watched me with a smile of satisfaction that turned my stomach. "That wasn't bad, Professor," he said in a mocking tone. "I understand why my son is so infatuated with you." I wanted to scream at him, hit him, do something to wipe that smile off his face, but I was trapped, powerless. I could only look at him with contempt before running out of the room. The following days were a nightmare. I felt dirty, used, unable to look at myself in the mirror. Every time Luke touched me, I shuddered, remembering his father's hands on me. Guilt consumed me, not only for my relationship with Luke, but now also for this new betrayal. But the worst was yet to come. A week after my encounter with Robert, I received another message from him. He wanted to see me again. And it was then that I realized the true nature of my situation. This was not going to be a one-time event. Robert planned to continue this blackmail indefinitely. The realization that Robert's blackmail wouldn't be an isolated event hit me like a sledgehammer. I felt trapped in a downward spiral from which I saw no way out. Each day was a struggle to maintain composure in front of my colleagues and students, including Luke, while inside, I was falling apart. Guilt and shame consumed me. Not only was I betraying my ethical and professional principles with my relationship with Luke, but now I was involved in an even more compromising situation with his father. I constantly wondered how I had reached this point, how an educated and respected woman like me had allowed her life to become this tangle of secrets and lies. I tried to distance myself from Luke, hoping that if I ended our relationship, somehow I could free myself from Robert's control. But Luke noticed my change in attitude and became more persistent in his attempts to get close to me. His genuine concern only increased my guilt. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult class where I could barely concentrate, Luke followed me to my office. He closed the door behind him and looked at me with a mixture of confusion and pain. "Helen, what's going on?" he asked. "You've been acting strange lately. Did I do something wrong?" His question, so full of sincere concern, was like a dagger in my heart. I wanted to tell him everything, to free myself from the weight of the secrets that were crushing me. But how could I tell him the truth without destroying his world? "Luke," I began, my voice trembling, it can't continue. It's a mistake. It always has been." I saw the pain reflected in his eyes, and I hated myself for being the cause. "You don't mean that," he said, moving closer to me. "What we have is real, Helen. I know it." I stepped back, keeping the distance between us. "You're my student, Luke. I'm your professor. This should never have happened." "Is it because of the age difference?" he asked, the desperation clear in his voice. "Because of what others might think?" "None of that matters, Helen. I love you." His words hit me hard. Love. How could he talk about love when I was trapped in this web of deception, when I was betraying him in the worst possible way? "You don't understand, Luke," I said, struggling to maintain composure. There are things you don't know, things that complicate everything." "Then tell me," he insisted. "Whatever it is, we can face it together." For a moment, I considered telling him everything, about his father, about the blackmail, about how I felt trapped and desperate. But as I looked at his young, trusting face, I knew I couldn't do it. I couldn't destroy his relationship with his father. I couldn't expose him to this dark world I had gotten myself into. "I'm sorry, Luke," I finally said, gathering all my willpower. "But this is over. Please, don't insist anymore." I saw how hope faded from his eyes, replaced by a mixture of pain and confusion. Without saying another word, he turned around and left my office, closing the door harder than necessary. I collapsed in my chair, the tears I had been holding back finally flowing freely. I had done the right thing by ending things with Luke. I knew that, but that didn't make it hurt any less. That night, as I lay awake in my bed, reflecting on the ruins my life had become, I made a decision. I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't continue being a pawn in Robert's twisted game, nor could I continue betraying the trust the university had placed in me. The next morning, with a determination I hadn't felt in weeks, I headed to the dean's office. It was time to face the consequences of my actions, however painful they might be. I knocked softly on the door, and after hearing a "come in," I entered. The dean looked up from his papers, surprised to see me there without an appointment. "Helen," he said, "how can I help you?" I took a deep breath. knowing that the words I was about to utter would change the course of my life forever. I need to confess something to you. I began, my voice firmer than I expected. I've made a serious error in judgment, and I'm here to take responsibility for my actions. The dean looked at me with a mixture of concern and confusion, indicating that I should continue. And so, with a heavy heart, but with the certainty that I was doing the right thing, I began to tell my story. I told him about my inappropriate relationship with Luke, omitting the most intimate details, but not excusing my behavior. I told him about Robert's blackmail, although I decided not to reveal his identity to protect Luke. I explained how I'd felt trapped, desperate, unable to see a way out. As I spoke, I saw how the dean's expression changed from surprise to disappointment, and finally, to a kind of resigned compassion. When I finished, there was a long silence in the office. "Helen," the dean finally said, his voice grave, "you understand the gravity of what you're telling me, don't you?" I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. "I understand completely, and I'm prepared to face the consequences." The dean leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "We'll have to initiate a formal investigation. You'll have to be suspended while this is carried out, and I must warn you, Helen, that this is very likely to result in your dismissal." His words, though expected, hit me hard. The reality of what I was losing, my career, my reputation, everything I had worked for decades, settled on me with its full weight. "I understand," I managed to say. "I appreciate your honesty in coming to me with this," the dean continued. "But I must ask you, why now? What made you decide to confess?" I looked out the window of his office, towards the campus that had been my home for so many years. "Because I couldn't live with the lie anymore," I replied. "Because, despite everything, I still believe in the integrity and ethics that I've always tried to instill in my students. And because it was time to do the right thing, regardless of the personal cost." The dean nodded slowly. "I see. Well, Helen, I'll keep you informed about the process. For now, I ask that you gather your things and leave campus. We'll contact you soon with more information." I left his office feeling strangely light. Yes, I had lost everything I had worked for. Yes, my future was now uncertain, but for the first time in weeks I could breathe, without feeling the crushing weight of secrets and lies. As I was packing my things in my office, I heard a knock on the door. It was Luke. My heart raced at seeing him, a mix of love and guilt flooding me. "I've heard rumors," he said, his voice tense. "Is it true? Are you leaving?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, Luke. I've confessed everything to the dean. Well, almost everything." I saw the confusion and pain in his eyes. "Why? Why did you do it?" "Because it was the right thing to do," I answered simply. "Luke, I'm so sorry for everything. I never meant to hurt you." He remained silent for a moment, processing my words. Then, to my surprise, he stepped forward and hugged me. "I forgive you," he whispered. "And thank you for doing the right thing in the end." We parted, both with tears in our eyes. "Take care of yourself, Luke," I said softly. "And please talk to your father. There are things you need to know." With those enigmatic words, I watched him leave my office for the last time. As I left campus, carrying a box with my belongings, I felt strangely at peace. I had lost much, but I had regained something invaluable, my integrity. I didn't know what the future held for me. I would probably have to change careers, maybe even cities. The road ahead would be difficult, full of obstacles and judgments. But for the first time in a long time, I felt free. I looked back one last time towards the buildings that had been my home for so many years. Then, with a sigh, I turned towards the uncertain but possibility-filled future that awaited me. This experience had taught me painful but valuable lessons about integrity, ethics, and the consequences of our actions. I knew I would carry these lessons with me forever, using them to guide my future decisions and perhaps someday to help others who find themselves in similar situations. As I walked to my car, I felt I was closing a chapter of my life and opening a new one. I didn't know what awaited me, but I was ready to face it with honesty and courage. Because in the end, our integrity is the only thing that truly belongs to us. And I had regained mine.